We're going to talk about cows. Cows getting screwed. By what? By the screwworm. Well, it turns out that the screwworm, well, it's not quite as large as this, but it isn't really a worm. Although it looks like one. It is the larva of a fly. And the fly looks like an ordinary housefly. And it lays eggs. And it can lay eggs in wounds of cows. And the eggs hatch into larvae, which then turn into the screwworm. Why is it called the screwworm? You can see by its appearance, it has these ridges on it that make it look as if it were a screw. And it actually screws itself into the wounds of cows, and then it eats the animal from the inside out. Not good for the cow. Not good for farmers either, who are raising the animals to sell as meat. This was a huge problem in the southern US in the early days of the 20th century. And at that time, really the only way to control them was to monitor very carefully if a cow had some kind of a wound, and the farmer would quickly have to come and use some sort of insecticide. And in those days, the insecticide that was used against the screwworm was extracted from chrysanthemums. It was safe enough, but it didn't really control the problem on a large scale. Well, two entomologists are researchers who study insects, by the name of Knipling and Bushland, got interested in trying to control the screwworm fly. And they made an interesting observation. It turns out that the female mates only once in its life, but the males, of course, will do it as frequently as they can. So the idea was that if they can sterilize the males, they may go out and mate with the female, but there will be no offspring, and the female will not try to mate again. It was a pretty good idea. But whatever chemicals they tried to sterilize the fly didn't work. But then in 1950, Knipling read a paper, and this was written by a Nobel Prize winner, Muller, who had noticed that fruit flies became sterile when exposed to X-rays. Well, this hatched an idea. What if the screwworm could also be exposed to X-rays and be sterilized? Well, luckily they had a friend who worked in a hospital and who had access to an X-ray machine. So off they went with a bunch of flies, and indeed they were able to sterilize them. Turned out that it worked in the lab. But would it work on a large scale? Luckily, the island of Curacao in the Caribbean had an infestation of screwworm flies. This was a very good place to try it on an island, because there potentially could wipe out the whole population. So what did the researchers do? They did an airlift, and they dropped sterilized male flies over the island, and indeed, within a couple of months, the population went way down. Then they tried it in the southern US, and they essentially eliminated the screwworm fly. This was a huge development for the farmers and also for consumers, because they ended up paying less for meat. There have been sporadic outbreaks since then, but basically the fruit or the screwworm fly is being controlled. You know, when the researchers first told their colleagues about what they wanted to do way back in the 1930s, that they had the idea of sterilizing flies to control the population, one of their colleagues quipped, "I don't think that you guys can catch enough screwworm flies and castrate them." Well, of course, they had no idea of castrating them. That was not the point. They wanted to sterilize the flies on a large scale, and it turned out that X-rays did the job. And since that time, since the 1950s, when this was put into practice, there has not been any major outbreak. So you never know where science is going to lead. Who would have ever thought that the invention of the X-ray would lead to the control of the screwworm flies in the US, and that it would be the X-ray that would end up screwing the screw fly?